Amid the chilled dawn of April 1945, two scenes clashed on a muddy road, leading to the American collection point near the Rhine. A column of elderly German women, hunched and trembling, and a pile of U.S. Army medical crates stacked with geometric precision under a sagging canvas sheet. The contrast struck sharply. On one side stood fear, hunger, and the residue of a collapsing Reich. On the other, supplies marked for aid rather than punishment. The women stared at the crates anxiously, unsure whether they signaled safety or something far more complicated. For years, Nazi broadcasts had filled their nights with warnings about the Americans, how enemy troops would seize German women, humiliate them, and repay every bombed city with cruelty. These messages had seeped into their thinking so deeply that fear became instinct. So when the Americans advanced through their district and rounded them up with hundreds of displaced civilians, the women braced themselves. They were not soldiers, only widows, seamstresses, retired cooks, and former factory auxiliaries forced into the chaos of the Reich's final retreat. Yet the propaganda had convinced them that age, innocence, or circumstance would offer no protection. The American soldiers they encountered did not resemble the monsters described by the Reich. They kept rifles angled toward the ground, their movements steady, their posture weary. A few exchanged murmured jokes, while others hauled crates toward the camp entrance. No one barked orders. No one shoved them. If anything, the soldiers seemed cautious, as though aware of the women's fear. Ahead, the temporary camp came into view, collection point C3, built from rope, canvas, and wooden posts hammered into wet soil. Smoke from a cook stove drifted above the tents, carrying the scent of coffee. The women halted without being told, watching as medics stepped between tents with clipboards and blankets. The scene defied every expectation. Nothing resembled cages or punitive holding cells. A young military policeman approached as their group neared the gate. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he noticed the oldest woman, 78, weakened by weeks of flight, struggling to keep her balance. With careful restraint, he touched her elbow. She flinched, but the soldier merely steadied her. Another soldier offered a canteen, lifting it enough for each woman to drink. Their gestures unsettled the women more than hostility would have. Registration took place beneath a canvas awning where a lantern flickered against the drizzle. The Americans asked each woman for her name, age, and origin, recording them on damp rosters. The soldiers spoke slowly, each word shaped with patience. When one woman misheard, the medic pointed to the line she needed to sign, repeating the instructions with a tap of his pencil. There was no anger, only courtesy. It disarmed them more than commands ever had. Beyond the table, the flap of the medical tent swayed with the wind. Through the opening, the women glimpsed cots, folded blankets, and steam rising from metal cups. They watched as older men, farmers and mill workers captured that morning, stepped out carrying packets of aspirin and fresh bandages. They did not look mistreated. Some walked straighter than before. The women exchanged tense glances. A soldier barely older than their grandchildren approached with a crate of field rations. He sat on a bench and motioned for them to take one packet each. Inside were items rare as miracles, canned meat, crackers, dried fruit, and a tiny envelope of coffee. For months, they had survived on watery soup. Seeing such abundance offered freely overwhelmed them. One woman hesitated, assuming she would be punished. The soldier nudged the box gently, encouraging her. She took the ration with trembling fingers. As they ate, warmth returned to their hands. Around them, the camp's rhythm unfolded with quiet order. Medics moved quickly but without impatience. MPs adjusted tent lines, trading low conversation. The women sensed no malice. This confused them profoundly. Fear had long been their armor. Now it felt unnecessary. When one woman collapsed, her legs buckling, two Americans rushed forward, lifting her with surprising care. They guided her to a chair, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The women watched silently. Nothing in the party's warnings had prepared them for such gentleness. They felt the ground shift beneath their certainties. By late afternoon, Processing was done. The women expected confinement behind wire. Instead, the soldiers guided them to a lightly fenced area with benches, a small stove, and stacks of blankets. The fence seemed more for order than control. The women sat cautiously, clutching the blankets. The 78-year-old rested her hand on a wooden post, breathing slowly. Her eyes scanned the camp. Medics arranging supplies, soldiers adjusting lanterns, a chaplain speaking softly with a wounded man. Nothing resembled the brutality she had been warned to fear. She felt the first crack in the wall built by propaganda and loss. Before night fully settled, the group exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that something irreversible had begun to shift within them. Their world had been built on warnings, yet here they saw actions that contradicted every rumor. Even the silence of the camp felt different, more like the calm of a place where strangers were trying to be kind. As dusk deepened, the women shared quiet confessions. One admitted she had not been addressed with respect in years. Another whispered that she feared the kindness would vanish by morning. The lanterns flickered, casting thin halos on the mud. Then, as the camp settled into calm, the 78-year-old looked toward the medical tent where a soldier prepared another cot. Her voice drifted across the benches now. If this is how they treat us, then the world outside our borders is not what we were told it was. Dawn seeped through the camp's canvas edges as a pale, bluish light, carrying with it the cold breath of the river and the smoke from the American cook stove. The elderly women rose stiffly from their benches, expecting the illusion of gentleness to dissolve with the daylight. They braced for harsher orders, stricter guards, or some delayed punishment the night had postponed. Instead, they found the camp moving with the same controlled calm they had witnessed the evening before. Soldiers tightened tent ropes, medics checked supply lists, and an officer scribbled into a leather notebook. No shouting, no aggression, only the brisk rhythm of a military operation built not on fear, but on discipline. The women gathered near the boundary rope as a military policeman approached with a clipboard. He motioned for them to follow, and the group hesitated, unsure if this was when their treatment would finally turn. Yet when they reached the medical tent, the young MP paused, gesturing for them to step inside first. The gesture shocked them more than an order would have. In their world, men marched first, women followed. But here, hierarchy felt different, gentler, almost inverted. Inside, warm air drifted from a field stove. Cots lined the walls in neat rows, each topped with folded blankets and a tin cup. A medic, sleeves rolled to his elbows, tapped the edge of a cot to invite the first woman to sit. She moved cautiously, hands clutching her threadbare shawl, eyes darting from the medic's calm expression to the stethoscope resting on his chest. He spoke softly, repeating each instruction twice. When he pressed the cold disc against her back, she stiffened. He apologized at once, stepping back. No German doctor she had ever known apologized for discomfort. Not during the war, not before it. The medic's behavior unsettled her more than any examination. Another woman sat opposite him, wringing the hem of her dress. A translator, an American GI whose German carried a faint Midwest softness, knelt beside her. He explained that the medics were required to check blood pressure, pulse, and signs of exhaustion. Required. The word startled her. Required by whom? It seemed impossible that any army would mandate kindness. Yet the translator repeated it without hesitation, as though it was the most ordinary rule in the world. She blinked, absorbing the notion that the Americans were following an obligation to care, not to punish. Adjacent cots filled with elderly civilians, some captured earlier that morning, some transferred from nearby villages. The women watched as a medic offered aspirin and a cup of warm broth to a man barely able to stand. The man accepted it silently, then whispered, "Danke." The medic nodded respectfully, neither patronizing nor triumphant. Respect was threaded through every gesture the women witnessed. Slowly, suspicion began to thaw. Outside, the camp stretched in carefully arranged zones. A small administrative shack where rosters were updated, a kitchen area where water boiled over metal burners, and a fence perimeter marked not by barbed wire, but by rope and wooden stakes. It was meant to guide, not trap. The women noted this detail with quiet astonishment. The rope could be stepped over easily, yet no one attempted to cross it. The soldiers' demeanor made escape feel unnecessary. At midday, the women assembled near the cook's stove, the steam rising from the pot, giving off the scent of beans and canned pork. Their hunger gnawed fiercely, and when food was served, they expected smaller portions, perhaps scraps reserved for detainees. Instead, each woman received a full ladle. No more, no less. Identical to the portions handed to American soldiers waiting in line beside them. The equal treatment unsettled them deeply. One woman, who had worked in a munitions factory where officials barked orders and supervisors scolded even the elderly, trembled as she accepted the metal plate. She whispered to the woman beside her, "I have not been served like this since before the war." Across the camp, American soldiers repaired equipment, washed their canteens, and wrote letters home. Occasionally, a private would glance toward the women, offering a polite nod, then return to his duties. Their indifference to the women's nationality was more surprising than any overt kindness. They were not being treated as enemies, but as people caught in the war's undertow. The realization felt both relieving and frightening. If the Americans were not the monsters they had been told to fear, what else had been untrue? Later in the afternoon, a chaplain visited the camp. His uniform bore the small, unmistakable cross stitched above his pocket. He approached the women with slow, deliberate steps, as if mindful of their fragility. Without insisting on prayer, he merely asked whether anyone needed rest or comfort. He offered his blanket to a shivering woman and remained sitting beside her until her breathing eased. The simplicity of his kindness carried a weight none of them could fully articulate. Yet the women's fear did not vanish in an instant. Doubt lingered behind every moment of compassion. One woman resisted when a medic tried to examine her swollen ankle. She recoiled, clutching her skirt, convinced this was the moment their treatment would reveal its hidden cruelty. Instead, the medic stepped back, placed the stethoscope gently in her palm, and guided her fingers over the cool metal. He waited until she nodded before continuing. Such patience disarmed her completely. As the day stretched toward its waning hours, the women were escorted to a sheltered corner of the camp where a pile of blankets awaited. A soldier explained, slowly, in broken German, that the weather would drop sharply by nightfall. He pointed toward the sky, where clouds already thickened, promising cold. The women accepted the blankets reluctantly, unable to understand why their comfort mattered to anyone here. Throughout the afternoon, they began noticing small acts that chipped away at their fear. A soldier adjusted the height of a bench so the oldest woman could sit without pain. Another retrieved an extra tin of crackers for a woman who admitted quietly that she had not eaten since the previous morning. A young MP carried 2 buckets of water for them so they would not have to walk across the muddy field with trembling legs. None of this resembled the harsh reprisals the Reich had described. When evening returned, the camp seemed softer than it had the night before. Lanterns glowed warm inside the tents. The scent of coffee lingered. Medics murmured reassurances as they checked on the elderly before night rounds. The women sat in a loose circle, reflecting on the day with a mix of disbelief and tentative relief. They compared memories of their factories, their shelters, their local officials, none of whom had shown them the gentleness they received here. But beneath the relief lay a deeper, quieter conflict. If the Americans treated them with humanity, then the Reich's warnings were lies. And if those warnings were lies, what else had been twisted? What else about the world beyond their borders had been hidden? The thought unsettled them more than fear ever had. Truth, it seemed, could be as disorienting as propaganda. As darkness settled, a medic made his final rounds. He paused near the 78-year-old woman, offering her a tin cup of warm water. She accepted it with trembling hands. Her eyes lifted toward the lights of the camp, where soldiers were finishing their duties under the fading sky. She whispered, more to herself than anyone listening, "We are treated better here than in our own factories." The other women fell silent. The truth hung between them, delicate and undeniable. As the lanterns flickered and the wind carried the distant murmur of American voices, they sensed something shifting, not only around them, but within them. They did not yet understand what this shift meant. But tomorrow, the real revelation would come. Morning light crept over the camp in thin, hesitant streaks, illuminating the canvas edges and the frost that clung stubbornly to the makeshift benches. The elderly German women stirred beneath their blankets, their joints stiff from the cold, their minds turning over the same question. Why were they being treated with such care? The fear that had guided their every instinct since capture had softened, but it had not vanished. Fear rarely disappeared in a single night. It dissolved slowly, replaced molecule by molecule with something unfamiliar: doubt, curiosity, fragile trust. A medic entered the enclosure with a metal clipboard tucked under his arm and a steaming pot in his hands. He greeted them gently, his voice carrying the warmth of the broth he poured. The 78-year-old lifted her cup, inhaling the rising steam as though it were the scent of another lifetime. She could not remember the last time anyone had offered her food without suspicion or ration stamps. The medic noticed her hesitation and added a quiet reassurance, one she did not fully understand but felt safe here. As the women sipped, the translator from the previous day stepped into the tent with a bundle of neatly folded papers. His German, tinged with an American softness, carried an unusual tenderness. He explained that the camp had received new instructions. All elderly detainees required priority medical review and were to be given additional rest periods. The women listened in silence. They were accustomed to being overlooked in a society that valued productivity and youth. Yet here, among foreign soldiers, they were suddenly treated as precious and fragile. They followed the translator outside, where the camp buzzed with purposeful activity. Soldiers repaired equipment, stirred pots, and updated rosters with pencil strokes that seemed too calm for wartime. A few glanced toward the women, offering brief nods of recognition. None looked at them with suspicion or superiority. The absence of judgment unnerved the women almost as much as the kindness. At the medical tent, a chaplain arranged wooden stools in a semicircle. He motioned for the women to sit, then handed each of them a warm cloth to clean their hands. He spoke slowly, careful not to impose faith or doctrine. Instead, he asked simple questions. Did they sleep well? Did they feel safe? Did they need anything? The questions moved the women more than any sermon could have. They were used to surviving invisibly. Yet here someone regarded their comfort as worthy of concern. One woman, bent from years of factory work, confessed that her ankle throbbed painfully. The medic knelt before her, rolling up her skirt with permission and examining the swollen joint. His touch was gentle, clinical, and respectful. She stared at the crown of his hat, overwhelmed by the realization that an enemy soldier, someone she had been taught to hate, treated her injury more attentively than the factory supervisor who once shouted at her for slowing production. Another woman clutched a small cloth bag containing her last possessions. She feared the Americans would confiscate it, as retreating German officers had taken whatever they pleased. But when a soldier approached, he merely offered to help her tie the fraying string. He stepped back afterward, hands raised in a gesture of reassurance. Her confusion grew. Everything she was witnessing contradicted the image of Americans she had carried throughout the war. As the morning passed, the camp's atmosphere shifted further. Civilians from nearby villages arrived seeking medical aid, and the women watched as soldiers treated them with equal courtesy. A mother with a young child received a wool blanket. An elderly man was given aspirin and water. No one was turned away. The women exchanged glances filled with a quiet, growing awe. Whatever the Americans were, they were not the merciless invaders the broadcasts had portrayed. Yet doubt lingered within the oldest woman. She approached the translator hesitantly and asked whether this kindness would last. Her voice cracked as she wondered aloud if they would eventually be placed in a harsher captivity. The translator paused, then explained that the Americans followed strict rules. Rules meant to protect civilians, rules that held even in war. He added softly that his parents had been German immigrants who taught him to honor elders. The woman's eyes watered at that. She had forgotten what it felt like to be honored. The day warmed, melting frost and softening the mud beneath their feet. Soldiers invited the women to sit near the sunlit edge of camp, away from the cold shade. One woman laughed quietly, an involuntary, fragile sound, when a private offered her his own jacket to sit on so the ground would not chill her bones. Another soldier adjusted her scarf when the wind caught it. These tiny gestures accumulated like falling snowflakes, subtle yet transformative. Still, not all fear vanished instantly. When a medic reached to check the pulse of a woman with trembling hands, she recoiled, whispering that she did not trust instruments or needles. Instead of insisting, the medic placed the stethoscope in her palm, letting her feel the harmless metal. He guided her fingers along its curves, allowing her to understand through touch what words could not convey. Her breathing slowed. She let him proceed. By late afternoon, the women gathered near the boundary rope, watching American soldiers help civilians load supplies onto carts. Each scene layered upon the last, reshaping their worldview. The Americans were not saviors, not saints, just men performing their duty with a humanity the women had neither expected nor believed possible. As dusk approached, lanterns flickered on, casting soft halos across the camp. The translator approached once more, holding a folded paper with orders stamped in official ink. He informed them that tomorrow they would learn something important, something that concerned their fate in the next chapter of their lives. The women exchanged anxious glances. The fear they thought they had shed returned in a gentler form, uncertainty mixed with fragile hope. The 78-year-old clutched her blanket and whispered, "Whatever comes next, it cannot be worse than what we feared." The translator did not answer. He merely held the paper closer to his chest, as though its contents carried a truth they were not yet prepared to receive. Tomorrow, everything would change. The next morning arrived with a hush that seemed almost ceremonial, as if the camp itself understood that something decisive was about to unfold. The elderly German women stood near the boundary rope, waiting for the translator to return with the orders he had guarded so carefully the night before. Soldiers moved around them with their usual rhythm, yet the air felt different, lighter, calmer, touched by the sense that the war's violence was finally loosening its grip. Smoke curled gently from the cook stove, and the distant rumble of artillery, heard every day until now, had fallen nearly silent. Even the river carried a quieter current. When the translator emerged from the administrative tent, the women straightened instinctively. He held the paper with both hands, a crease across his brow betraying the weight of what he was about to say. He greeted them with the same soft tone they had grown accustomed to, but there was a hint of warmth beneath it, as though he had been waiting for this moment as much as they had. He explained that the Americans were conducting a final review of all detainees deemed non-combatants. The women listened with held breath. Their futures depended on the interpretation of a few typed lines. Then, with deliberate clarity, he delivered the news. They were to be released. Not transferred to another camp. Not marched to a holding facility. Released. They would be escorted to a nearby village where civil affairs officers would assist them in finding temporary shelter, food, and medical support. The women stared at him, unable to grasp the meaning. Freedom had not been part of their expectations. They had imagined interrogations, relocations, punishment for crimes they never committed but feared they would be blamed for. Instead, they were being told they would leave the camp not as prisoners, but as civilians in need of protection. The realization struck them slowly, landing with a mixture of joy, confusion, and disbelief. A medic approached with a stack of small cards, each stamped with an eagle and printed with instructions in both English and German. The cards granted priority access to food lines, medical posts, and temporary shelters. Resources the Americans were distributing across occupied territory to stabilize the civilian population. Wind could not undo. As the group prepared to leave, a truck rolled toward the gate, its wooden panels marked with the white star of the U.S. Army. The women climbed aboard carefully, guided by soldiers who held their arms with the gentleness reserved for grandparents. The engine rumbled to life, and the camp, once a place of fear, then of revelation, began to fade behind them. They looked back through the slats of the truck, absorbing the final image. Soldiers moving about their duties, medics tending to new arrivals, the chaplain speaking softly to a wounded man, lanterns still flickering in the morning haze. Not a single rifle was pointed at them. Not a single guard hurried them away. The scene was as peaceful as any they had known before the war. As the truck rolled down the muddy road, the women began to speak in quiet voices, almost afraid to disturb the fragile peace forming around them. They compared their experience to the warnings they had been fed for years. Warnings of cruelty, vengeance, and humiliation. None of it had come true. Instead, they had been treated with a dignity that felt almost extravagant in the wake of their suffering. One woman confessed she had not felt respected since her husband died in 1942. Another murmured that she had expected to die behind wire, not ride towards shelter. The oldest woman, clutching her priority card, stared at the passing trees with tears in her eyes. If they had hated us, she whispered, they would not have cared whether we had blankets. As they approached the village, the truck slowed. American civil affairs officers, wearing armbands marked MG for military government, stood ready with clipboards and crates of. The women accepted them with trembling hands. These slips of paper felt impossibly fragile, yet they carried a power greater than ration books or work papers ever had. They were symbolic proof that someone, an occupying army, no less, had decided their well-being mattered. As preparations for departure began, the camp's soldiers moved with an ease that contrasted sharply with the tension of the previous week. A young private helped one woman gather her belongings, adjusting the strap of her satchel so it wouldn't dig into her shoulder. Another soldier offered his canteen to the oldest woman, insisting she drink before the walk. She hesitated, then took a small sip. The water tasted like warmth, like safety, like something she had forgotten long ago. One woman, overwhelmed, reached out to touch the sleeve of a medic who had tended her swollen ankle. She thanked him in a whisper, not entirely trusting her voice. He nodded, eyes soft with understanding. War had aged him beyond his years. Yet in that moment he looked impossibly young, as though the simple act of helping her had returned a piece of himself that the fighting had nearly stripped away. The chaplain appeared to offer a final blessing. He did not preach. He simply told them they had survived something few could imagine, and that survival itself was a form of courage. His words settled over them like a second blanket, warming them in ways the cold supplies. They greeted the women with calm professionalism, directing them toward a station where warm soup simmered in metal pots. It was an orderly, humane operation, designed to steady a population staggering out of ruin. The women stepped down from the truck, their feet touching ground that was no longer enemy territory, but the first step toward rebuilding shattered lives. They carried with them almost nothing, just a few possessions, a blanket, and the cards the Americans had given them. Yet these things felt heavier with meaning than any burden they had borne during the war. As they walked toward the shelter, they paused instinctively, glancing back at the departing truck, at the road that had delivered them to mercy instead of misery. In that moment, they understood something profound. They were leaving with more than aid. They were leaving with a new truth, one that contradicted every lie they'd been taught. Kindness had survived the war, and it had reached them first not from neighbors or officials, but from the soldiers they had been taught to fear most. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And please support us by liking the video and pressing the hype button for the video after that. It helps us a lot.